Ahoy! Hashtag Zach here. Today, I'm going to make the claim that in war, tactics and strategy do more to determine the winner than any numbers or technology difference could. I just want to make one thing clear before I begin. I'll be making an argument on a topic that's debated to this day by military officers and other professionals. So this is just me looking at the evidence and stating what I think. A lot of this evidence comes from Stephen Biddle's book, Military Power. The first claim I'm going to debunk is that you can reliably predict the outcome of a war by whoever has the larger population, larger or better funded military, or more resources. The following chart lists multiple variables we can analyze in comparing countries who are at war with each other, such as GNP, gross national product, which is an economic measure, or things like population, military personnel, military expenditure, which is how much countries spend on fighting equipment, and the composite index of national capability, which is looking into resources that countries can use to fight. As you can see, the fractions of the times a war's result has been predicted correctly by these features is not very good. It really hovers around 50-50. And let's ask ourselves, do we really want generals making decisions about whether or not they'll win wars based off of a coin flip? Now, some might criticize that graph because they could say, well, it depicts situations with a large difference in numbers and a small difference in numbers with the same weight. There's really no difference in measurement. So we should look into some more information. This chart compares the difference in the defenders and the attackers for their military expenditure as a ratio on the x-axis, and on the y-axis it shows attackers killed per defender killed. What we would expect is, as the attacker spends more and more compared to the defender, there is less and less attackers killed per defender. However, there isn't a trend like this. As each of these points of different wars show, there's no clear correlation between spending on your military and having better success at killing opponents on the battlefield. Now that I've established my claim that numbers and spending don't guarantee success in war, I'm going to make the claim that technology can't either. This scatter plot compares the difference in technology from the attacker to the defender compared to attackers killed per defender killed. Now, if you really stretch your imagination, you can kind of see a correlation from the top left to the bottom right, where as the attacker's advantage gets better and better, the amount of attackers killed per defender gets less and less, but the correlation is weak at best. A counter-argument I can imagine many people making is, you can say whatever you want with all these numbers and statistics, but look at the real world in, say, Operation Desert Storm in 1991, when the United States military, with vastly superior tank technology, attacked a similar number of Iraqi tanks, which had less technology, and came out on top, and it wasn't even close. However, barely over half of the United States tanks were the Abrams tanks from the 80s. Many of the U.S. tanks, especially those used by the Marine Corps, were the Patton tank, initially designed and built in the 1950s. And they were up against tanks that had been built by the Soviet Union in the 1970s. Clearly, there wasn't a technological edge in tanks here. Therefore, we can say that wars like that do not disprove the argument I'm making. Another counter-argument that could be made is that the U.S. had far superior logistics and supply lines, so they could take full advantage of their strengths, while the Iraqi military couldn't really do so. However, this is beside the point because I'm not claiming that the Iraqis could have managed to have the supply lines to invade the US. I'm only saying that the Iraqis' lack of numbers and technology did not determine their defeat, and that, given other factors, they could possibly have defended themselves. Another factor that's closely related to the material advantage is the home court advantage. However, as this graph shows, that is not a reliable predictor of military success either, as it's never really having a strong effect of more than 80% or even close to 80% in either direction. I hope I've made my point that military superiority through numbers and technology does not guarantee victory. Now, I'm going to make the claim that strategy and tactics can. This chart shows how defenders can employ depth and reserves to prevent breakthroughs. So, what exactly do these terms mean? Well, depth is how long their defense is supposed to take in terms of distance. As opposed to holding the line exactly in place, they intend to have to retreat during their defense to force the attackers to slow down, as opposed to fighting in one fixed spot. This has the benefit of confusing the attackers and preventing them from staying organized. As you can see, the higher we go on the chart, meaning the more kilometers of defense that there are prepared, the wider the chances are of a contained offensive. The other statistic this chart looks at is the fraction of forces in reserves. This means what percentage of the defender's forces are away from the front line, held in small groups, who are ready to respond to wherever the call of danger is, and concentrate where the battle is, as opposed to having all of the troops spread out evenly across the whole line, not really able to support each other. If you combine these two very important principles together ideally, you have a lot greater chance of containing the offensive and preventing a breakthrough, which is where the attacker succeeds in conquering the territory. These statistics were drawn from dozens of wars from across the 1900s, and unlike the statistics on material superiority, these statistics on tactics show that there is a clear correlation between how well you organize your defensive line and how successful it is at preventing a breakthrough. So if depth and reserves are the two factors that make for a very successful defense, what kind of factors would suggest a successful attack? This would be what author Stephen Biddle calls the modern system, a triad of stealth, maneuver, and combined arms. The idea behind stealth is to have small groups of foot soldiers move in independent groups to take advantage of natural folds in the earth that are far too small to conceal large groups of infantry or tanks. However, concealing small groups of soldiers would be quite easy, as, say, in northern Germany, the plains conceal roughly 80% of the square feet within 1,000 meters of any given spot. While these irregularly scattered places of cover can easily conceal small groups of infantry, they are practically useless when you're looking at formations of thousands of infantry marching together who clearly are not using the teaching of stealth. This aspect of stealth is so important in the modern era, given the strength of weapons today, as there are bombs, rockets, and even shoulder-launched weapons from infantry that can tear through inches and sometimes even feet of metal or concrete. Nothing can protect against this unless you can't be seen in the first place. The idea of maneuver is to beat your opponent without having to fight them at their full strength, but isolating small pockets of them by maneuvering around them and encircling them and robbing them of their supply lines. This will make them outnumbered, weakened, and very likely to surrender. The alternative would be to send all of your forces in frontal assaults against your opponents everywhere, which would put you on a level playing field and would not necessarily guarantee success. This is why the concept of maneuver is so important, as it allows you to win without having to fight your opponent at their strongest, while you are at your strongest. The idea of combined arms is to have the cooperation of infantry, tanks, transport vehicles, scouting vehicles, and air cover, and sometimes even artillery, so that you can have the strengths of all of these different types of units covering each other's weaknesses. For example, infantry are great at concealment, but not very good at maneuver because they're on foot. They need transport vehicles. Also, they could be going into areas blind, which is why they need fast scout vehicles to see what's ahead of them. Sometimes, when they encounter really heavily fortified enemy units that they really need to dislodge in order to continue maneuvering, that's where they need tanks, that mobile, heavy firepower. And if they're ever really in a tough spot where they're overwhelmed and a spot where they least expected it, the air power can come at the last moment, really fast, to save the day. Employing only one kind of military unit without any kind of combined arms is often a recipe for catastrophe. Take, for example, certain tank deployments in World War II, where large groups of only tanks would go to attack enemy positions. They didn't have artillery or air support that could fire behind tree lines or walls that they couldn't see through. When they got into narrow, tight spaces where they needed to maneuver in small environments, they were way too big to do so. They needed infantry. This really is not ideal, even though tanks can be very powerful when they're in their ideal circumstances and supported. These all sound like some really good ideas. Let's look at some numbers in a graph format to see how they really measure up when tested in reality. A battle that we can use as a case study is Operation Michael, a massive German assault towards the end of World War I. Why I pick this battle in particular is because it was, as this chart shows, the first major battle in World War I in which an attack was able to pick up significant amounts of territory after the introduction of machine guns and heavy artillery. Because as you can see, although in early 1915 there were several majorly successful battles all the way on the top left, this really dropped off once heavy artillery and machine guns were introduced. Michael was the first major battle to break this trend, and I argue that it was because of the poor tactics of the Allies that allowed this to happen. This chart shows the depth in yards of a defensive line. Depth was one of the two key principles we talked about for a modern system defense that employed good tactics and strategy. As we can see, when Germans launched Operation Michael, this was one of the lowest depths of defense that World War I had seen at overall. The other key principle we talked about for having a good defense was having reserves, so that you could have active troops moving around that you could send in wherever there was trouble. As you can see from this graph, Michael saw one of the lowest defensive reserves seen in any major battle towards the end of World War I. The fact that Operation Michael was the first major battle of World War I to break the trend of being completely stopped by machine guns and artillery is proof of my assertion. It's not just a coincidence that it happens to be the lowest rate of depth and reserves of any battle towards the end of World War I. While I admit that is only one battle, if you look at overall trends from all of the 1900s, it is not a unique incident. The first line, farthest to the left, shows what happens when a modern system of attack meets a non-modern system of defense. The more attackers they have, the amount of territory the attackers can take skyrockets. When a modern system attack meets a modern system defense, you can see from the middle line there, the attackers can gain ground when they have a significant numerical superiority. However, if it's a non-modern system offense against a modern system defense, the line is almost completely flat. Yes, this does show that numerical superiority can make a difference. However, only when it's in the vast extremes. The one thing that does make a vast difference when only one variable is changed, having a modern system tactic and strategy. So overall, while having superior numbers and technology can make winning a war a lot easier, attacks are won through stealth, maneuver, and combined arms, and defense is won through depth and reserves. Thank you very much for considering my argument. I hope you learned something, and that now you can form an opinion of your own. Please comment, like, and subscribe, and see you next time.